This is the Authority Partners podcast.
Hello everyone, my name is Adam Mikanovic, Solution Architect in Authority Partners. Today with me, I have my good friend, good colleague, Q enthusiast, Q guru, Imer Mulhovic, and we have a really nice team to discuss today, Microservices testing made easy. Imer, welcome. Thank you for doing AP podcast first of all, and I'm honored actually to be your host today. Can you tell me a bit more about this topic, and especially like this buzzword, made easy? Like testing is never easy.
Hey, Adan. Thank you for bringing me on here. You're really far too kind with this introduction. So, the title really isn't true. You really can't make testing easy. You can definitely make it easier. And the issue is, so for a short intro, currently, for most things that people start building, microservices kind of become like the default architectural choice because thanks to AWS and Azure, you can run these Azure functions or AWS Lambda functions really, really quickly and cheaply. But they also bring with them a host of issues when it comes to actually testing them. For example, because, these are two third-party platforms. And if you want to do some tests, then you really have to think about your pipelines, first of all, the availability of those pipelines and another issue that you generally run into is the state management for your tests. So as you create more and more microservices, you tend to create a bit more debt. For example, if you want to test them, you can either choose the integration approach where you're directly testing the service, or, for example, you can try mocking. But then you run into this other issue where if you mock a service, then you also have to maintain this mocked service in addition to the service itself. So while microservices are really a great choice for a lot of applications, as they scale up and grow, the debt for testing tends to grow with them. So they really do bring together with them a lot of new challenges. And that's what we're here to talk about today. How can we resolve these challenges and hopefully make the testing easier? I skipped the in the title of the topic, definitely.
That's fine. But more traditional QA, and what people would usually choose, okay, we are just going to focus on, let's say, UI testing, but they will not even take care of what is the architecture of the application they are testing. And that's why I love that you actually mentioned all of this. And as you said, yes, integration is one of the options how we can test it. But QA is developing and there are new types of testing. And I guess today we are also going to talk about contract testing. And I would like you to explain to audience basically what is even contract testing.
Thank you. That's actually the next point that I was going to get to. So when we think of testing, what are we actually thinking about? We're thinking about developing a service and making sure that service works properly. So how do we ensure that the code that we create, whatever we implement, how do we ensure that it's working correctly before actually deploying it into a user environment? Generally, the answer for this is integration testing. However, as I've already mentioned, there are some issues you might run into it if you have a lot of services. Another really cool way of testing that's recently become a lot more popular, thanks to the popularity of microservices, is contract testing. So what it is, it's actually consumer-driven contract testing. So let me explain this. Not really buzzword, but this 4-word sentence. So consumer-driven basically means that the development of, let's say, an API is driven by the API's consumers. Let's say you have some API and it's consumed by mobile applications, it's consumed by web applications. So basically it means that you take into consideration how the API is actually used. That means that it is consumer-driven. The contract testing part refers to the contract between the consumer and you, the team that's developing this API, which is also called the provider. In this type of testing, we don't really do any integration. Instead, it's done in a bit of a different way. So every consumer, it doesn't matter how many of them you have, they write their so-called contract tests where the only part of the API that they actually validate is the format of the request and the format of the response. That's it. And all of this gets collected, all of the requests, responses, their formats, the validations, they get collected into a file called a contract. Then this consumer takes this contract and sends it to you, the provider. Then you, the provider, can run your own provider tests to make sure that the functionality of the API that you are providing matches the contract that the consumer is expecting.
Is it fair to say you are testing the one microservice, you have agreement what type of request he's going to do, he should handle, what type of the request, what type of the response, like the format of the response he should put back. So there is a signed contract between communication that you will just verify, and that's it. So it's actually the name actually even self-explains it, which is really nice. They do. But basically, what about how do you test there also the negative scenario? Like you are not going to accept some request, or you cannot
yes.
even send some. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, definitely. Because, I mean, the negative requests, the negative responses, they are part of the contract. Your consumer needs to know if, for example, are you always going to respond with an okay, even if an error occurs, or which is, it's not really following the best practices, but for example, GraphQL APIs, they always respond with a 200. Or are you going to put the 404? Is it going to be a 500 if you don't find something, or 22 maybe? There's an entire range of responses that you can do, and you have to have a contract with your consumers on what to expect.
So basically, even if you have 100 microservices, you will totally do it independently. You will just make sure each one of them is actually respecting the contract they have.
Yes, and they will also make sure that they are respecting the contract together with you, because the problem isn't necessarily on your side. It might be a misunderstanding of the contract from the consumer side as well.
Makes sense. This is really perfect.
Yeah, because I mean, you also know, like in our day-to-day work, a surprising number of issues can rise up if, for example, you have a string instead of an integer. It's a very silly issue, but it pops up all the time because the contract wasn't followed by one of the parties in the interaction.
So, like, you are working for quite some time now testing microservices, and you are using contract testing. I know there are benefits, but let's first talk about drawbacks, because I think it's more interesting to see what are the challenges, drawbacks, and then actually to talk about benefits, if you agree.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it, I think. So what are the drawbacks? Well, there's only one player in town. That's the drawback for me. So basically, there's this framework called PACT, and they are the de facto framework for doing contract testing. There are some other implementations, but those implementations haven't really gone very far. So you only have to rely on this one framework, and doesn't matter which language you are coding in, it has to be this one framework. Second issue in my case is, you still have to write the tests. If you already have, for example, an API testing suite, and now you want to do contract testing, it might not be a good idea, because it's basically rewriting your entire work for the past 2 years. It's difficult to get buy-in. And I'm not just talking here, for example, on the QAs that are supposed to write these tests. It's also difficult to get the buy-in from the developers as well. For example, if you have like under one project a bunch of different teams, some working on creating consumers, others working on providers, you have to get all of them to agree to do contract testing. This isn't really something that you can do, just one team writing the contract tests. No, it has to be a project-wide initiative if you want to achieve, if you want to have this provide value for you.
But if you think about it, everybody would benefit actually also of documenting it. Like if you approach contract testing with Gherkin syntax, for example, and I saw a few examples in our company that are using it, it's actually pretty nice because they are getting literally the documentation itself about the APIs that they create, and they can actually communicate through documentation, even provide that documentation tomorrow when something needs to be changed, it can be used to see what is affecting immediately. So I think there are many benefits that we could sell to the team itself and basically try to implement it. But people are usually reluctant to changes. That's the, I think, main issue.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's difficult to change something, especially if that something has inertia behind it. So you really have to show people like, this is how we can do this. Like, let's start working on this. And if you go through the back documentation, they also have like a bunch of, use cases when you should be using contract testing, when you shouldn't be using contract testing. So, I mean, contract testing is a great thing if you are just developing something. Like if it's not something you're going to like use on a legacy system, which is something we actually had the idea of doing, but found out that, for example, the pact.net framework we're using doesn't even support older technologies. So there's no no web APIs, like you cannot do any SOAP calls with it. You have to use like RESTful APIs and GraphQL if you want to do these contract tests. So it's definitely got some drawbacks when it comes to backwards compatibility, let's say.
But if you are doing the refactoring of the legacy code, basically for that part of the system also, it's not worth it to implement it, or you would go there?
So if you are just going to refactor and move this to a new framework, I would, because you are definitely going to run into some new bugs created by the refactor. However, if we are talking about just like some stable API, even if it's like done with the latest technology, it doesn't matter. If it's stable, if it's not going to change, then contract testing really isn't worth it, in my opinion. If it's not something that's been there since, it was in active development, and it's kind of too much to also add that in.
Thanks, Simir, for explaining it. Let's talk about benefits, actually, to try also to explain to people why to use contract testing. Can you tell me a bit more about benefits of using it? I know there are limitations with PactNet, but I mean, there are still many benefits of using it. Can you give to our audience explanation what those would be?
Well, it really, really reduces the need for integration testing. I mean, in some cases, you could say it completely removes it, because it allows you to gain confidence in your deployments. I mean, if you have contract testing implemented, if you have the part of your CI/CD pipeline, you can get literally a verification that the new code you're going to push is going to work with all of your consumers. So if you have a bunch of different services consuming your API, you can then know for sure that, hey, this is going to work. And it really skips on having, it really removes the need to do any additional testing in the environment you're deploying to. You can run these tests at the same time you run the unit tests, because for the consumer part and for the provider part, these can be written like during development. You don't have to have a finished product to use it. So it really, really helps you massively shift left when it comes to testing. And shifting left, as you know, is our biggest QA buzzword.
Yeah, actually, and it's very important if we want to achieve tomorrow DevOps implementation and get feedback earlier. So basically, this helps us all because of the feedback that we are getting without even having ready product, which is actually amazing. But as you said, like it can replace integration testing, but also partially only, or we can actually totally rely on contract testing and totally forget about integration testing, because in that case, this is not yet additional effort. This is already, let's say, part of the effort of any implementation today.
So integration testing, a lot of the time, so contract testing, the thing about contract testing to keep in mind is it is not functional testing. You can do some functional validations, but the advice is not to do it. It's just to check the format of the response and the request, and that's it. Doesn't matter what are the side effects of it. So for these situations, we would still, I think, need contract tests, especially need integration tests, because if we are running a complicated business scenario and trying to test a part of it, we still need integration testing in my mind, but we can remove a lot of it definitely using contract tests.
That's great. Thank you, Imer. And let's go back a bit to PackNet. Basically, you have experience, you already used it. So could you give us a brief explanation, like what was your challenge, like how to start with? Is there any like documentation that you read, or it's already there on PackNet website, or you read some books, podcasts, like how even to start with PackNet? What would be your suggestion for the newcomers?
So the Pact website has got really good documentation. First of all, explaining how to do contract testing, and another website is PactFlow, which is it's a service which helps you like validate these contracts, and they also have very good animations explaining how Pact works. So PactNet is the C# implementation of Pact. All, I think, different language implementations are done by the same, core Pact team. And they have pretty good documentation. They also have this workshop. You can find the link to it on their website. It's just a 1-hour GitHub workshop where you like create a very simple RESTful API, write the consumer tests, have them fail, write the provider tests, etc. And you can really be up and running with this in like an hour. But that is, but there are some issues. For example, like these workshops, they're old code, and I had this problem where, they pushed out a beta like Pact 4.0, and the workshop was written in 3.0, and like nobody updated it. So I learned a lot just by debugging the code, actually. And, but honestly, one of the biggest challenges for me was just writing the tests, because as I mentioned, this is a very shift left approach, and contract tests, you are supposed to be running them together with unit tests. Now, I have really got a lot of experience with testing a RESTful API, but I do not have that much experience with writing a RESTful API, especially because some of the APIs that we are writing the contract tests for, they're not using, for example, .NET 6, they're using .NET Framework. So the issue for me was that myself as a QA had to like step into this position of a backend .NET developer just to like write these contract tests, as you have to like spin up an instance of the API that you're running. And if it's a bit of an older API, you will definitely run into issues with, legacy code.
From what I heard, implementation of cross-functional teams, Scrum teams, where we have dev and QA specialists, is also going to help with implementing of contract testing, because you can directly work with your developer to define it and write it faster, and even run it to verify your code together with your developer and everything else. So it's a bit harder if it's a separated QA team, because there's usually lacking the collaboration if they are separated. So this all goes also, I guess, in the implementation of Scrum cross-functional teams.
Definitely. And Pact and contract testing in general, the best way to think of contract testing is as a communication tool, actually. It's, helps different teams communicate as to what's the issue in our contract. So communication really is a big part, I think, of this testing methodology. So as you said, having cross-functional teams talking to each other, it really does help in doing this. And I also want to mention, you asked me about resources for this. Besides the entire official Pact documentation, there are also a series of 6 blog posts by Bas Dijkstra on his website on test automation. And he really goes, deep down into contract testing and, the pros, the cons. He also goes into this so-called bi-directional contract testing, which is a new thing, not really an open source thing yet, where you can, where both the consumer and the provider write contracts and then just, compare them. So definitely a blog to follow in general if you're into testing, and especially if you're into API testing.
Thank you, Imer. I'm going to close this discussion now. Thank you for joining this, for sharing with us your knowledge, and for taking time to create AP Podcast. And soon we are going to have a new topic, and you can come and listen to AP Podcast to learn more things. Thank you once again, and talk to you soon.
Thank you, Adnan, and thank you for having me on. Bye-bye.
Bye.